The dead do not return at midnight asking for a last dance, and yet he was there, my husband, Adrian, the Duke of Ashford, standing in the threshold of my own ballroom as though the 3 years since his funeral had been nothing more than a bad dream from which we were both now waking. I should have screamed. I should have called for the servants, summoned the constables, fainted like a proper widow into the arms of the nearest gentleman. Instead, I set down my champagne glass with the steady hand of a woman who had learned long ago that composure was the only armor society would allow her to wear, and I looked into those familiar gray eyes and whispered a single word: impossible. That was the beginning of the end, though I did not know it then. My name is Catherine Ashford, and I am a woman who has spent the better part of 3 years perfecting the art of being dead inside while remaining breathing and walking and performing the rituals expected of a widow of rank and fortune. The morning Adrian was buried, I put on my black silk morning gown and never truly took it off. Oh, I changed my dresses, of course. Society demanded it, and I obeyed. But the color, the constraint, the peculiar weight of grief that society deemed acceptable remained sewn into every breath I took. The Duke's death had been ruled an accident. He had been driving through the fog on the Surrey road late at night. His horse had startled at something, a fox, a phantom, who knew what the mist concealed, and his carriage had overturned into the ravine below. They found him broken among the rocks 3 days later, his body delivered to me in pieces of dignity that no coffin could quite reassemble. The investigations had been perfunctory. He was a duke. He had been alone. It was foggy. These things happened to men who drove too fast through English nights, and there was no scandal to be excavated, no mystery that required the scrutiny of Scotland Yard. At least, that is what everyone believed. I had never believed it, not for a moment. I had always known that Adrian's death was far stranger than any accident could explain, but I had said nothing, not to my father, not to my solicitor, not to the detective who came to my sitting room and drank my tea and looked at me with the gentle, patronizing pity that men reserve for grieving women of little consequence. I had held his secret, whatever it was, close enough to my heart that it had become indistinguishable from my own anguish. This was, perhaps, my greatest mistake. The 3 years of widowhood had been strange and solitary, but they had also been peaceful in a way that my marriage never was. Adrian had been a cold man, brilliant and ambitious, with a mind that seemed to exist on some higher plane that I could never quite reach. He had married me because I was beautiful enough and well-born enough, and because his political position required a wife who could manage his estates and bear his name without cluttering his thoughts with feminine complaints or excessive affection. We had done our duty to each other with the kind of mechanical precision that characterizes so many aristocratic unions. He had taken his pleasure where he found it. I had found my solace in the library, in books, in the company of the few women who did not judge me for my inadequacy as a wife. And then, one night, everything had changed. The night he died, or the night I believed he died, which now seemed a laughably naive conclusion. Adrian had returned home in a state I had rarely seen him in. His collar had been torn. There had been blood on his cuff, though he claimed it was nothing, that he had merely cut himself while shaving. His eyes had held a kind of fervent terror, and he had paced the library for hours like a caged animal while I tried to read by the fire and pretend I was not terrified of him. He had not confided in me. Adrian never confided in anyone. But I had pieced together fragments from overheard conversations, from letters left carelessly on his desk, from the peculiar visits of a certain Dr. Nathaniel Gray, a man who moved through London's scientific circles with the kind of influence that suggested he wielded knowledge that others desperately wanted to keep hidden. I had tried to ask Adrian about it. I had attempted, in my gentle and circumscribed way, to understand what had frightened him so profoundly. He had simply smiled, that cold, distant smile that had been his response to most of my attempts at intimacy, and told me that I was not to concern myself with his affairs. A wife, he said, was far too fragile to bear the weight of a gentleman's serious concerns. So I had not pressed further. I had said nothing, and 3 days later he had driven into the fog and disappeared into what everyone had assured me was a tragic accident. But he had not been buried in the churchyard at Ashford. I had been the only one to insist on examining the body, and the damage was so extensive, the features so deliberately obscured by the ravages of the fall and the subsequent weeks of exposure, that I could not have sworn with absolute certainty to his identity. I could have said something then. I could have raised a question that might have changed everything. I had not. Instead, I had signed the documents that the solicitors placed before me, collected the properties and the fortune and the title of Duchess, and I had returned to my black silk morning gowns with a kind of relief that I am only now, in this retrospective hour, willing to admit. For 3 years, I had been free from the cold demands of a husband who saw me as an ornament and an annoyance, free to occupy my own mind and my own heart, free to attend to my own thoughts without the weight of a man's expectations crushing me into smaller and smaller shapes. The masquerade had been perfect. I had been a woman of consequence, a widow of rank and fortune, yes, but also a woman whose status was defined entirely by her absence, by her loss, by the space the dead man had vacated. Society adored me in the way it adores objects of pity, elevated to nobility. I was invited to all the best gatherings. I was consulted on matters of charity and fashion. I was, for the first time in my life, heard when I spoke. And then, 3 days ago, I had planned this ball, a grand affair to benefit the Children's Hospital, a charitable gesture that would demonstrate my ongoing relevance to London society. It was meant to be a triumph, a showcase of my good taste and my devoted service to the less fortunate. I had spent weeks overseeing every detail: the flowers, the orchestra, the arrangement of the rooms, the menu prepared by the finest chefs in London. I had wanted it to be perfect. I had wanted to show the world that I was more than a beautiful woman abandoned by death and circumstance. I was a person of substance, of judgment, of worth. The evening had begun well enough. The guests had arrived in a cascade of silk and jewels and carefully curated enthusiasm. The orchestra had been exquisite. The flowers, white roses from the hothouses of Kent, arranged in crystal vases the color of champagne, had released their perfume into every room like a benediction. Women had complimented my gown, a silver-gray confection that walked the careful line between mourning and celebration. Men had bowed and shown me the kind of attention that feels both warm and hollow, the attention reserved for beautiful widows of rank and independent means. I had been holding court near the great staircase when I felt it, a change in the air, as though someone had opened a window onto a storm. The music faltered, just slightly, just enough that a person of sensitive constitution might notice the disturbance. The conversations around me stuttered and stopped, like a music box wound down. And then the crowd had parted. He stood in the doorway between the foyer and the ballroom, and the distance between us had seemed to contract like a held breath. He was wearing evening clothes, black tailcoat, white shirt, the elegant austerity that Adrian had always favored. He was thinner than I remembered, his face more angular, his eyes holding a light that I had never seen in my husband's gaze. But the silhouette was unmistakable. The particular tilt of his head, the way he moved with a kind of coiled precision through a room full of people, the absolute certainty of his place in the world. It was all unmistakably Adrian. I heard someone gasp. I heard a woman mutter the word phantom, as though the laws of nature had been suspended and the dead had indeed begun to walk among the living. I heard the orchestra master's frantic efforts to restart the music, to provide some kind of cover for what was clearly an impossible situation. Adrian's eyes found me across the room, and he smiled. It was not the cold smile I remembered. This smile held warmth and apology, and a kind of desperate longing that transformed his entire face. He walked toward me with the deliberation of a man approaching his own execution. The crowd retreated before him like a tide going out, leaving him stranded on a shore of polished marble and electric silence. I found myself unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but watch his approach, as though I were a woman carved from stone. When he was close enough to speak quietly, close enough that only I could hear him above the renewed but uncertain murmur of the orchestra, he extended his hand. "Duchess," he said, and his voice was Adrian's voice, and yet not quite. There was something deeper in it, something more worn, as though the past 3 years had aged him in ways that both did not begin to measure. "Will you do me the honor of a final dance?" And God help me. I said yes. We danced in the ballroom for exactly 3 minutes. I counted them like a woman counting down to some inevitable catastrophe, each measure of the waltz a step closer to a truth I was not sure I wanted to know. Adrian held me with a formality that was almost painful. His hand on my waist, neither warm nor cold, his other hand gripping mine with a tension that suggested he was afraid I might dissolve if he did not hold me firmly enough to the material world. We moved through the steps like two people performing a ritual whose meaning had been lost to time, and around us the guests watched with the furtive fascination of observers at an execution. I could not look at his face. I kept my eyes fixed on the white rose pinned to his lapel, watching it blur and sharpen with the turning of the dance, and I became aware of a strange disconnect between the man holding me and the body that memory insisted should be buried beneath 6 feet of English earth in the Ashford family plot. He smelled the same, that particular combination of tobacco and bergamot and the indefinable scent of his skin, and yet there was something else beneath it, something chemical and faintly acrid that I could not quite identify. When the music ended, he did not release me. Instead, he guided me toward the French doors that opened onto the terrace beyond, his hand at the small of my back steady and inevitable as fate. I should have pulled away. I should have created a scene that would have given the gossips of London something to occupy their tongues for months. Instead, I allowed myself to be led into the darkness like a woman under a spell. The night was cold and clear, stars visible above London for once, the fog having lifted as though nature itself wanted to bear witness to what was about to unfold. The terrace overlooked the gardens, the same gardens where Adrian had once kissed me, 3 months into our marriage, when he had still believed that passion might flourish between us like roses in spring. The kiss had been brief and perfunctory, and we had never repeated it. He released me only when we had reached the far end of the terrace, far enough that the light from the ballroom could not quite reach us. The darkness felt both like a shelter and a trap. "You are angry," he said. It was not a question. "I am many things," I replied, and I was relieved to discover that my voice was steady. "Angry is perhaps the smallest of what I am feeling at this moment." "I can imagine," Adrian said, and he turned to look out at the gardens. In the starlight, his profile was achingly familiar and entirely strange. I have rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times since I made the decision to return. I have imagined every variation of your response, every way you might choose to reject me or curse me or demand answers that I do not have the right to refuse you. But now that I am here, now that I can see your face and hear your voice, I find that all of my careful preparations have fled like birds disturbed in their roost. "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me how you are standing on my terrace when I buried you 3 years ago. Tell me why you have orchestrated this return, this spectacle, this cruelty." He flinched at the word, and I felt a twist of something in my chest, not quite satisfaction, not quite regret. "I did not orchestrate it," he said quietly. "Or rather, I did, but not in the way you might imagine. I have been alive for all 3 years, Catherine. I have been imprisoned, if you will, but alive. And I have thought of you every single day in that imprisonment, wondering if you were well, if you had found happiness in the space that my absence created, if you had discovered the freedom that I denied you in life." I wanted to rage at him. I wanted to demand explanations, reckonings, restitution for the grief and confusion he had caused. Instead, I heard myself ask, with a kind of distant curiosity, "Who else knows?" He turned to face me fully, and in the starlight, I could see that he was studying me with an intensity that was almost unbearable. "That is not the question a truly grieving wife asks," he said softly. "That is the question asked by a woman who had already begun to suspect that my death was not what it appeared to be." "I have always been a pragmatic woman, Adrian," I replied. "Grief is a luxury that pragmatism does not often permit." He reached out slowly, as though afraid that sudden movement might cause me to flee. He took my hand in his, and the warmth of his skin was so undeniably real that I had to suppress a sound of distress. This was not a ghost. This was not a fever dream or a hallucination brought on by the champagne and the emotional turbulence of the evening. This was my husband, alive and solid and inexplicably present. "I need you to trust me," he said. "I know that I have forfeited any right to ask for your trust, but I am asking it nonetheless. Will you come with me? Away from this house, away from London, to a place where I can tell you everything without fear of interruption or discovery?" "And if I refuse?" I asked, though I was already running through the practical considerations of such an escape, what I would need to pack, what servants I could trust, how I would manage my affairs in my absence. "Then I will disappear again," he said, "and you will never know the truth. You will spend the rest of your life wondering whether tonight was reality or madness. And more importantly, you will never understand the danger that still exists, the danger that my return tonight has set in motion." "Danger to whom?" I demanded. "To you? To me? To both of us," Adrian said. "To anyone who discovers that I am alive and that I know what I know. There is a man, Catherine, a scientist, a brilliant and utterly ruthless man named Nathaniel Gray. He conducted an experiment on me, a procedure that he had been developing for years. It was meant to extend life indefinitely, to unlock the secrets of human consciousness and transfer them to a new vessel, a new body, constructed according to specifications designed to eliminate all weakness, all limitation. I was not a willing participant in this experiment. I was blackmailed into it. I felt the ground shift beneath me, as though the stone terrace had become a ship on stormy seas. "What do you mean, blackmailed?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand, beginning to see in his words an explanation for the fragments of conversations I had overheard, the strange visits, the terror in his eyes the night he died. Adrian released my hand and began to pace, his movements sharp and agitated. "Gray had discovered something about me," he said, "something that would have destroyed everything. My title, my reputation, my marriage, my place in the world. He threatened to expose it unless I agreed to undergo his procedure, to become a kind of prototype for a new form of human existence. I agreed because I was a coward, Catherine, because I valued my position more than I valued my integrity, because I could not face the world knowing what it would know about me." "What did he discover?" I pressed, though part of me did not want to know the answer. "That I am not the man the world believes me to be," Adrian said, and he stopped his pacing to look at me directly. "That there are aspects of my nature, my desires, my essential being, that would be considered abhorrent by every society that has ever existed. That I am the kind of man who, if the truth were known, would be imprisoned or worse. That I am a man capable of destroying not only myself, but everyone connected to me through shame and association. I understood then, in a sudden and shattering way, that my husband was telling me something that he had never been able to tell anyone, a secret that had corroded him from the inside out, like acid eating through stone. And I understood, with a clarity that seemed almost cruel, that this secret was not the reason for his absence. It was the reason he had needed to disappear. "So you underwent this procedure," I said slowly, "and when it failed—" "It did not fail," Adrian interrupted. "That is the horror of it. It succeeded. I died on Gray's operating table, Catherine. My heart stopped beating. My consciousness ceased. And then, 3 days later, I awoke in a new body, constructed from materials I did not know existed, animated by a process that I do not fully understand. I have spent 3 years trying to comprehend what I have become, and I have realized that I am no longer entirely human, if, indeed, I ever was. I thought I might faint. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and the stars above suddenly seemed impossibly distant and cold. A new body. Materials I did not know existed. A consciousness transferred like water poured from one vessel to another. "Where have you been?" I whispered. "These 3 years? In a laboratory beneath the city," Adrian said. "In a house hidden so carefully that London society could not find it if it searched for 1,000 years. Gray kept me there while he studied the effects of the procedure, while he documented the way I was adjusting to my new existence. I was his greatest success and his greatest failure, the only survivor of his program, but also the only one of his creations to maintain consciousness, to retain memory, to become aware enough to understand what had been done to me." "And you escaped?" "I killed him," Adrian said flatly. 3 weeks ago, I saw an opportunity and I took it. I walked out of his laboratory and burned the house to the ground, and then I spent 3 weeks arranging the means to come to you." He said it as though he were discussing nothing more remarkable than a change in the weather, but his hands were shaking. I noticed it then, the slight tremor that ran through him like an electric current, the sign of something barely held in check beneath the surface of his careful words. "Why?" I asked. "Why come back now? Why reveal yourself, knowing what you are risking?" Adrian moved toward me again, and this time he did not ask permission. He pulled me against him, and I felt his heart beating beneath my ear, rapid and powerful, and somehow wrong, as though the rhythm were slightly off, as though the organ were not quite in synchronization with the rest of his body. Because I realized, in that laboratory, that I had already lost 3 years of my life to fear and secrecy and self-loathing, he said into my hair. Because I thought about you every single day, and I realized that the only thing worse than dying would be living without ever seeing you again. Because I wanted, for whatever time I have remaining in this new body, to know what it might be like to be loved by you, genuinely loved, not out of duty or social obligation, but loved for who I truly am. I pulled away from him, needing to see his face. "And what if I cannot love you?" I asked. "What if what you have become is too far removed from what you were for me to bridge that gap? What if I see you, and I see only a ghost, a copy, a mockery of the man I married?" "Then I will accept that," Adrian said. "But I had to try. I had to give you the choice that I was never given, the choice to know the truth and decide whether to accept it or reject it. And more than that, I had to warn you." "Warn me of what?" "That Gray is not entirely dead," Adrian said, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I set the fire, yes, but I did not see him burn. And if there is anyone on this earth who is as obsessed with immortality and the transformation of the human form as Gray was, it is the possibility that he survived, that he is still searching for me, that he might come for you as a way of extracting vengeance or retrieving me or continuing his work." The implication of his words hung between us like a sword suspended by a thread. "So you have brought danger to my door?" I asked quietly. "I have brought myself to your door," Adrian corrected. "Whether that constitutes danger or salvation remains to be seen. But I would not blame you if you called the constables right now and had me arrested as a madman or an imposter. I would not blame you if you asked me to leave and never return." He stepped back, giving me space, giving me the illusion of choice, even though we both knew that the choice had already been made the moment I had said yes to that final dance. "Come with me," he said. "Tonight, leave this house and this life and this identity, and come with me to a place where we can begin again. We have 3 years to recover, Catherine. 3 years of conversation and truth and the possibility of something that neither of us has ever experienced. And we have very little time to decide if we wish to attempt it." I thought of my life as it had been, the beautiful, empty existence of a widow of rank and fortune. I thought of the certainty and the safety and the respectability of that life. And then I thought of the moment when Adrian had appeared in the doorway of my ballroom, and I thought of how alive I had felt in that instant, how real, how terrified and exhilarated, and finally, genuinely myself. "I need to know," I said slowly, "whether you are the man I married or a creation of his laboratory. I need to know if there is any part of the Adrian I knew inside this body, or if you are something entirely new." "I do not know the answer to that question," he admitted. "I have asked it of myself 1,000 times, and I have never arrived at a satisfactory conclusion. What I do know is that I remember loving you before I was afraid to love anyone. And I know that in this new body, with this new consciousness, that love feels different. Less painful, perhaps, or maybe more honest. But it is there, Catherine. It is there." I took his hand. It felt real and impossible all at once. "I will come with you," I said. "But not tonight. Tonight I will dismiss my guests. I will explain my sudden indisposition. I will set my affairs in order. Tomorrow night I will leave this house and I will not return. And you will have all the time you wish to prove to me that you are not a ghost, that you are not a monster, and that this love you claim to feel for me is worth the price of everything I will lose by following you." Adrian closed his eyes, and I saw something break across his face, relief or sorrow, or both. "Tomorrow night," he repeated, "I will be waiting for you on the Surrey Road, where my carriage overturned all those years ago, at midnight. Will you come?" "Yes," I said, and the word felt like a promise and a prayer and a resignation all at once. "I will come." He leaned forward as though to kiss me, and then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he pressed his forehead against mine for a moment, and I felt the strangeness of his new body, the warmth that was too perfect, the heartbeat that was too measured, the presence that was too substantial to be entirely real. Then he released me and moved back toward the garden, disappearing into the darkness with a finality that left me standing alone on the terrace, wondering if I had dreamed the entire encounter or if I had just made a decision that would reshape the rest of my life. The music from the ballroom seemed very distant and very small, and the stars above seemed to shine with a terrible brightness. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my dressing room until the servants had cleared away the last of the ballroom decorations, until the orchestra had packed their instruments and departed into the fog-laden streets of London, until even the kitchen staff had extinguished their lamps and retired to their quarters. I sat in the dark with a glass of brandy that I did not drink and traced the path of my life backward through time, searching for the moment when I should have acted differently, spoken differently, chosen differently. The truth was that I had known something was terribly wrong the night Adrian drove into the fog. I had known it in the same visceral way that animals know when a storm is approaching, a tightness in my chest, a cold awareness that something fundamental was about to shift. But I had not spoken of it. Instead, I had let him leave the house without pressing for answers, without demanding to know what had frightened him so profoundly. I had permitted myself to remain in ignorance because ignorance seemed safer than the alternative. And perhaps this was the thought that truly tormented me as the night stretched toward dawn. Perhaps I had even wanted him to disappear. Perhaps some part of me had recognized that his absence would grant me a freedom that his presence, no matter how distant and cold, had always denied me. Perhaps I was not an innocent woman, caught in the machinations of a mad scientist and a desperate husband, but rather a woman who had silently willed my husband's departure and then pretended shock and grief at its fulfillment. The guilt of this realization was almost worse than the shock of seeing Adrian alive in my ballroom. It was the guilt of a woman who had gotten exactly what she had wished for, and then spent 3 years performing the rituals of mourning so convincingly that she had nearly convinced herself of her own sorrow. As dawn broke gray and cold over London, I began to write letters. I wrote to my solicitors, instructing them to place my estates under the management of a trusted associate. I wrote to the board of the Children's Hospital, expressing my regret that I would be forced to resign my charitable position due to personal circumstances that I could not yet disclose. I wrote to my lady's maid, whom I had come to regard with something approaching affection, telling her that I was embarking on an extended journey and that I would send word to her once I had settled in my destination. I did not write to my father. This was, perhaps, the cruelest decision I made in those early morning hours, but it was also the only one I could justify. My father was an aging man of considerable pride, and I knew that if I gave him any warning of my intentions, he would attempt to prevent them through a combination of rage and emotional manipulation. Better to disappear entirely and allow him to maintain the fiction that I had fallen into some kind of temporary mental derangement brought on by grief. Better that than to witness his shame and his anger and his sense of betrayal at learning that his daughter was capable of abandoning her position for the sake of a man and a mystery. By midday, I had begun to pack. I chose carefully. Practical clothing, traveling dresses, a small amount of jewelry that could be sold if necessary. I took the correspondence that I had been secretly receiving from Adrian over the past 3 weeks, hidden notes delivered by an aged woman who worked as Gray's former housekeeper and who had apparently developed a conscience about the horrors she had witnessed in that underground laboratory. I took the small leather journal in which I had begun recording my suspicions about Adrian's death, the fragments of conversation that did not quite make sense, the strange visits from the mysterious doctor, Gray. And I took, though I did not fully understand why, a small glass vial containing a clear liquid that had been enclosed with Adrian's last note. The note read simply, "If anything happens to me before you reach the Surrey Road, drink this. It will take you where I am." Whether it was a potion of death or transformation or something else entirely, I did not attempt to determine. I simply wrapped it carefully in silk and placed it in the bottom of my traveling case. The afternoon passed in a kind of waking dream. I received callers, well-meaning members of society come to inquire after my sudden indisposition during the ball, and I received them with the correct mixture of fragility and grace. I assured them that I had merely been overcome by the excitement of the evening, that I had suffered from a brief spell of vertigo, that I expected to be entirely recovered within a day or two. They departed satisfied, their curiosity sated, their need for gossip temporarily mollified by the assurance that there was nothing truly scandalous to report. But as the evening approached, as the moment of my departure drew near, I began to feel the weight of a confession pressing against my chest, like a physical thing. There was something I needed to do before I left London. There was a truth I needed to confront that had nothing to do with Adrian or Dr. Gray or the impossible science of consciousness transfer. There was a secret that I had been carrying for 3 years, one that had begun to feel less like a burden and more like a corruption eating away at the foundations of my character. I ordered my carriage for 10:30 and instructed the driver to take me to a certain address in Whitechapel, a neighborhood that no respectable woman of my station should be visiting at any hour, let alone late at night. The driver protested, of course. I overruled his objections with the kind of aristocratic authority that permits no argument. I wrapped myself in a heavy cloak and a veil, and I descended into the fog-laden streets of London's darkest quarter. The building I sought was a narrow 4-story structure wedged between a pawnbroker and what appeared to be an opium den. Its windows were dark, its entrance unmarked. I dismissed the carriage and stood alone on the pavement, wondering if I had finally lost whatever grip on sanity the past 3 years had left me. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps, and the door opened a crack, revealing the face of an elderly woman with wild gray hair and eyes that held the bright, fevered quality of someone whose mind has begun to fracture under the weight of knowledge too heavy to bear. "Mrs. Ashford," the woman said, and there was no surprise in her voice, as though she had been expecting me. "I wondered when you might come." Her name was Margaret Price, and she had been Dr. Nathaniel Gray's assistant for more than 15 years. She had witnessed his descent into madness as he pursued his obsession with transcending the limitations of human existence. And she had been present the night that Adrian was brought to the laboratory, drugged, disoriented, terrified, and placed on the operating table for the procedure that would transform him into something no longer entirely human. "He told you about it," she said, gesturing for me to enter the small room, which was cluttered with papers, anatomical drawings, and the detritus of a woman living on the margins of respectable society. "Adrian came to you and he told you everything." "He did," I confirmed, "though I confess I did not know that you were involved in his transformation. I had believed you to be merely a servant in Gray's household." Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I was far more than a servant," she said. "I was the one who performed the actual surgery, while Gray provided the theoretical guidance. I was the one who transferred his consciousness into the new body, though I never fully understood the mechanism by which that transfer occurred. Gray kept the true nature of his work secret from me, just as he kept it secret from Adrian. But I knew enough, Mrs. Ashford. I knew enough to understand that what we were doing was monstrous." She settled herself into a chair and gestured for me to do the same. The room was cold and damp, and I was acutely aware that I was sitting in a place that existed entirely outside the boundaries of the life I had constructed for myself. "I am not here to judge you," I said carefully. "I am here because there is something about that night, the night Adrian disappeared, that I have never been able to reconcile. I knew he was involved in something terrible. I knew he was afraid. But I did not try to stop him. I did not attempt to discover what was happening. And I have spent 3 years wondering if my silence made me complicit in whatever happened to him." Margaret studied me for a long moment, and then she rose and moved to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. She withdrew a small daguerreotype and handed it to me. It showed Adrian, but not as I knew him. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, his body laid out on what appeared to be an operating table. There was a long incision running down the center of his chest, and his skin held the waxy quality of recently deceased flesh. He was dead for 7 hours, Margaret said quietly. His heart had stopped, his brain showed no activity, his body was beginning to cool. We had failed, you see. The procedure had gone horribly wrong. Gray raged, he wept. He threatened to destroy us all if we could not reverse what had occurred. But I understood in that moment that Adrian was not meant to be revived. I understood that his death was the only merciful outcome to what we had attempted. But you did revive him, I said. The photograph trembled in my hands. You transferred his consciousness into the new body. I did, Margaret confirmed. Not out of any desire to save him, but out of fear. Gray had his hand on a knife, and he had made it clear that if I did not continue with the procedure, if I did not perform the consciousness transfer using the technology he had developed, he would use that knife on me. So I proceeded. I did the calculations that he demanded. I activated the machinery that he had constructed. I performed a miracle that should never have been performed. She returned to her chair and looked at me with eyes that held something like forgiveness. But there is something you need to know, Mrs. Ashford. Something that Adrian may not know himself. The consciousness that came back into that new body was not entirely Adrian's consciousness. The transfer was incomplete. Some portion of Adrian remained behind, trapped in the original body, or perhaps dispersed into the machinery itself. What returned was Adrian. Yes, but Adrian filtered through the distortions of the technology. Adrian altered and changed in ways that even I cannot fully comprehend. I felt the room tilt around me. Are you telling me that the man who returned to me is not my husband? That he is something else entirely? I am telling you, Margaret said slowly, that he is Adrian and not Adrian. He is your husband and a stranger. He is a man and a creation. He is human and post-human. He exists in a state that defies the categories we have constructed to make sense of the world. And because of this, he is capable of things that the original Adrian was not. He is capable of love that is not constrained by the social expectations that defined him before. He is capable of seeing you, truly seeing you, in a way that the aristocratic conventions would never have permitted. Why are you telling me this? I demanded. Why reveal these doubts now, when I am about to leave London with him? Because, Margaret said, you deserve to make your choice with full knowledge of what you are choosing, and because I made a choice to help create a being whose nature I do not fully understand, and I have come to believe that the only way to atone for that choice is to ensure that those who must live with the consequences of it do so with their eyes open. I rose from my chair and moved to the window. Below, the streets of Whitechapel were alive with the night activities of those who lived and worked in shadow. Prostitutes, thieves, people who existed outside the boundaries of respectable society. People not unlike myself, I was beginning to realize. There is something else, Margaret said from behind me. Something I discovered only recently, after Adrian escaped the laboratory. Dr. Gray was not alone in his work. He had a colleague, a woman named Helena Voss. She was responsible for the theoretical framework of the consciousness transfer, the calculations that made the impossible possible. When Adrian set the fire that burned down Gray's laboratory, Helena Voss was not present. Gray had sent her away weeks earlier after a disagreement about the ethics of their work. I turned back to face her. And where is this Helena Voss now? I do not know, Margaret admitted, but I know that she has been searching for Adrian ever since he escaped. I know that she blames him for the loss of her life's work, and I know that she is brilliant in a way that makes Gray look like a fumbling amateur. If she finds Adrian before you do, if she manages to recapture him, she may not be content simply to return him to a laboratory. She may wish to dismantle him, to study him, to understand exactly how his consciousness remains intact when all of her theories suggested it should have been permanently fractured by the transfer. My hands had begun to shake. I realized in that moment that Adrian had been telling me the partial truth when he warned me of danger. But the danger was far more complex and multifaceted than he had understood. We were not simply fleeing from the ghost of a mad scientist. We were fleeing from a woman who had constructed the very machinery that had transformed my husband into something neither of us fully understood. "I must leave," I said abruptly. "I must meet him on the Surrey Road before midnight." "Wait," Margaret called out as I moved toward the door. "There is one more thing. The liquid in the vial that Adrian gave you, it is not a potion of death. It is a serum that can stabilize the consciousness transfer, can prevent the degradation that will eventually occur if he does not receive periodic doses of it. Without it, Adrian will slowly lose coherence. His personality will fragment, his memory will deteriorate. Within a year, he will be entirely gone, and in his place will be a hollow shell animated by machine processes but devoid of the consciousness that makes him Adrian." I stopped in the doorway. "How often must he take it?" "Once every 3 months," Margaret said, "and there is very little of it left. I have enough to keep him functional for perhaps another 6 months. But after that," she spread her hands in a gesture of helplessness, "after that, you will need to seek out Helena Voss, and you will need to convince her to help you synthesize more, or you will watch the man you have chosen to follow gradually become a stranger to you, even as you learn to love him." I left Margaret's apartment without responding further. I descended the narrow stairs and emerged into the fog-laden streets of Whitechapel, and I felt the weight of impossible knowledge settling across my shoulders like a mantle made of stone. I had thought that coming to Margaret would bring me clarity, would provide me with absolution for my 3 years of willful ignorance. Instead, it had only complicated my understanding of the truth and deepened my sense of complicity in events that I had neither chosen nor controlled. The carriage ride back to my mansion felt interminable. I sat in the darkness and tried to reconcile the various truths I had discovered. That Adrian was alive, but not entirely human. That I was complicit in his disappearance, but not responsible for it. That the danger facing us was far more complex than either of us had understood. That love itself had become a kind of resistance against a future that seemed determined to fragment and scatter us both. I arrived at my house at 11:15. I moved through the silent halls with the stealth of a burglar, carrying my traveling case, and I made my way to the stables. The head groom was awake, as I had known he would be. I had instructed him to prepare a carriage for me under the pretense of an early morning departure. "The Duchess," he said, surprised to see me there at such an hour and in traveling clothes. "I am leaving London tonight," I told him simply. "I have decided to journey to the country for an extended stay. I trust this does not present you with any difficulties?" "None at all, Your Grace," he assured me, and I saw in his eyes the kind of discretion that comes from years of service to aristocratic families and their scandals. "I shall have the carriage ready immediately." I settled myself into the coach with my traveling case, and as the carriage pulled out of the city and toward the Surrey Road, I found myself thinking of the night that Adrian had supposedly died. I had thought in those 3 years that I had been grieving, but now I understood that what I had been doing was mourning not his death, but the ending of an impossible situation, the conclusion of a marriage that had never quite managed to be real. And now I was rushing toward an even more impossible situation, toward a man who was simultaneously a ghost and a resurrection, toward a love that might ultimately destroy us both. The fog thickened as we approached the Surrey Road, and I found myself remembering the way Adrian had told me that he loved me. Not as he had loved me before, if he had ever loved me at all, but as this new thing, this transformed creature, this post-human consciousness inhabiting a body constructed by science and madness. At midnight precisely, the carriage rolled to a halt on the exact stretch of road where Adrian's accident had supposedly occurred. And as I descended from the carriage into the fog, I could see a figure standing motionless by the roadside, waiting. He was still and patient, and very real. I walked toward him, leaving my old life behind with each step. Adrian was thinner than I remembered, or perhaps it was simply that the new body Gray had constructed for him was designed without the soft accumulation of flesh that comes from years of luxury and inactivity. He stood in the fog, with the patient stillness of a man who had learned to exist in states of suspension, waiting, holding himself in abeyance. When he saw me emerge from the carriage, something flickered across his face. Relief, perhaps, or joy, or the simulation of joy performed by a consciousness that might no longer be capable of genuine human emotion. I had resolved during the carriage ride not to tell him about Margaret's apartment, not to burden him with the knowledge of Helena Voss or the degradation that awaited him without the serum. I told myself that there would be time enough for such revelations once we had reached safety, once we had established ourselves somewhere beyond the reach of London society and the dangers that pursued us from both directions. But as I drew near to him and saw the particular tilt of his head, the way his eyes searched my face for confirmation that I was really there, I realized that I could not maintain such a deception. The love that was forming between us, if it was indeed love and not merely the collision of two desperate people seeking shelter from an impossible world, would require honesty in a way that my marriage never had. "I know about Helena Voss," I said without preamble. "I know about the serum. I know that you are degrading, that your consciousness is fragmenting, that without the medication that keeps you stable, you will eventually cease to be Adrian in any meaningful sense." Adrian's expression did not change, but I saw his hands clench at his sides. "Margaret told you," he said. It was not a question. "She did," I confirmed, "and she was right to do so. I have made a choice to follow you into exile and uncertainty, but I have not made it blindly. I understand what I am choosing. I understand the cost." Adrian turned away from me and looked out into the fog. In the distance, I could hear the sound of carriage wheels on the road behind us, my driver and the empty coach retreating toward London. "I had hoped to spare you that knowledge," Adrian said quietly. "I had hoped to give you a choice that was not complicated by the knowledge of my own mortality. I am still dying, Catherine. I did not escape that fate when I left Gray's laboratory. I merely postponed it. In another year, perhaps less, the consciousness that remembers loving you will be so fragmented that it will be unable to form coherent memory. In 2 years, I will be an animated corpse, beautiful and functional, but utterly devoid of the being that you are choosing to follow into the darkness. Then we will find Helena Voss," I said. "We will compel her to help us synthesize more serum. We will discover the mechanism of consciousness transfer well enough to prevent or reverse the degradation that Margaret described." Adrian turned back to face me, and there was something like tenderness in his expression. "You are speaking as though the future is still open, as though we have agency in what comes next," he said. "But we do not. The moment I returned to that ballroom, the moment I revealed myself to you, I set in motion a sequence of events that neither of us can control. Gray is dead, yes, but his work survives in the form of his colleague. Helena Voss will not help us, Catherine. She will hunt us because we represent the only successful outcome of her life's work, and because Adrian, this new Adrian, this post-human consciousness, represents the living embodiment of the ethical questions she has been avoiding for years. Then we will run," I said. "We will disappear into the continent. We will assume new identities. We will build a life that neither of them can reach." Adrian reached out and took my hand. His fingers were warm and perfectly proportioned, but there was something in the texture of his skin that was subtly wrong. Too smooth, perhaps, or too consistent in temperature, as though the construction of his body had perfected the human form by removing all of its natural variation and imperfection. "I want to believe that is possible," he said. "But I have been studying myself for 3 years, Catherine, and I have come to understand that there are limitations built into this body that I cannot escape. I am designed to function in a particular way, to thrive in particular conditions. The further I move away from London, the further I move away from the environment in which I was constructed, the more rapidly the degradation will accelerate. I can feel it already, a kind of loosening at the edges of my consciousness, a sense that the thoughts are becoming increasingly difficult to hold together." "Then we must not run," I said, and a new understanding began to form in my mind. "We must go to ground in London itself. We must find Helena Voss before she finds us, and we must confront her directly." Adrian's expression shifted to something that might have been alarm. "That is madness," he said. "Helena is far more dangerous than Gray ever was. She is brilliant and ruthless, and she has had 3 years to study the incomplete records that survived the fire. She has likely reconstructed much of Gray's work, and she will be watching every laboratory, every boarding house, Every cheap hotel in London where a couple of fugitives might try to hide. Then we will not hide, I replied. We will hide in plain sight. We will rent a townhouse in a respectable neighborhood. We will claim that we are a married couple recently returned from the continent. We will move through society as though we have nothing to fear. And in doing so, we will gain access to the circles in which Helena is likely to move. She will be expecting us to run. She will not be expecting us to turn and face her. Adrian studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his eyes, a kind of recognition, as though he were seeing me for the first time, not as the dutiful wife he had married, but as a woman capable of strategic thought and courage. "You are remarkable," he said softly. "I do not know if I have ever told you that. During our marriage, I was so consumed with my own fears and secrets that I never truly saw you. But I am seeing you now, Catherine. I am seeing you clearly, and you are remarkable." "I am not remarkable," I said. "I am merely a woman who has spent 3 years learning to live without the man she thought she had married, and who is discovering that the man she is about to marry is far more complicated and far more interesting than the original ever was. Now, we must move. We cannot remain on this road. If Helena is already looking for us, she will have made inquiries. She will know that I have disappeared from London. She will be setting traps." Adrian nodded, and he guided me away from the road and into the fog. A carriage was waiting in a small lane, a hired conveyance that apparently he had arranged through intermediaries before returning to my ball. We settled ourselves inside, and the driver, who asked no questions and seemed incurious about his passengers, guided us back toward London. I spent the journey in a kind of focused desperation, outlining to Adrian the plan that was forming in my mind. We would take lodgings in Belgravia under assumed names, Mr. and Mrs. Adrian Weston, recently returned from a tour of Italy. We would establish ourselves as minor members of the artistic community, people interested in scientific lectures and philosophical salons. We would make ourselves visible and accessible to the intellectual circles in which Helena was likely to move. And we would use our visibility to draw her out, to force her to reveal herself before she could fully deploy whatever resources she might have gathered. "You are speaking as though you have conducted intelligence operations before," Adrian observed. "I have not," I admitted. "But I have spent 3 years learning to read the society pages, learning to understand the patterns of gossip and movement within London's aristocratic circles. I have learned to observe people, to understand their motivations, to predict their actions based on the patterns of their behavior. It is not so different from military strategy, I imagine, merely applied to the drawing rooms and concert halls of polite society." Adrian reached across the carriage and took my hand again. "I am terrified," he said quietly. "Not of Helena, not of the degradation that awaits me. I am terrified of loving you and then losing you, either to her violence or to the dissolution of my consciousness. I am terrified that everything I remember feeling when I looked at you from the doorway of that ballroom will prove to have been merely an artifact of my construction, a program designed into my new body rather than a genuine emotion. And I am terrified that you will come to hate me for drawing you into this darkness. Then we are matched in our terror," I replied, "because I am equally afraid that what I feel for you is not love, but rather a kind of madness brought on by the impossibility of the situation. I am afraid that I am running toward you not out of genuine affection, but out of a desire to escape the emptiness of my former life. I am afraid that when the excitement fades and we are left in some small room in some foreign city, we will discover that we have nothing to say to each other and everything to regret." "Perhaps," Adrian said, "we are both capable of holding these fears and still choosing each other anyway. Perhaps that is what love actually is, not the absence of doubt, but the choice to proceed despite it." The carriage carried us deeper into London, and as the fog began to thin and the gas lamps of the city streets came into focus, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. We were no longer fleeing. We were no longer victims of circumstances beyond our control. We were protagonists in a narrative of our own making, and regardless of how that narrative concluded, we would face it together. We took lodgings in a narrow townhouse on a quiet street in Belgravia, claimed to be a couple of modest means but refined sensibilities. The landlady asked few questions, seemingly content with the weekly rent we paid in advance and the assurance that we would require minimal service. I began to construct a new life with the same methodical attention that I had previously devoted to the rituals of widowhood. I enrolled us in a lecture series on modern scientific theory at a private academy. I attended salons where artists and scientists gathered to debate the latest developments in their respective fields. I cultivated a reputation as a woman of intellectual interests and refined taste. It took 3 weeks before I heard the name Helena Voss mentioned in a conversation at one of these salons. A gentleman of perhaps 50 years, with sharp eyes and the bearing of a physician, was discussing his recent attendance at a private lecture given by a woman of exceptional scientific expertise. "Remarkable," he was saying to a small cluster of interested listeners. "Absolutely remarkable. She has developed a theoretical framework for consciousness that suggests it might be far more malleable than we have previously believed. She is working on some kind of experimental apparatus, though the details are frustratingly vague. But if even half of what she theorizes proves to be valid, it will revolutionize our understanding of human nature." I moved closer to the group with the appearance of casual interest. "This woman," I said lightly, "does she have a name?" "Dr. Helena Voss," the gentleman replied, and I saw something flicker across his face, a kind of fascination mixed with discomfort, as though he were describing something that fascinated and disturbed him in equal measure. "She is affiliated with a private laboratory in Southwark. I confess I have not met her in person. Our society is not the kind that encourages women to participate in scientific discourse, but her papers are circulating through certain educated circles, and they are causing quite a stir." I returned to Adrian that evening with news of Helena's location. He received the information with a kind of grim resignation. "Southwark," he said. "That makes a certain kind of sense. It is far enough from the respectable quarters of London to permit the kind of experimentation that would be shut down immediately in Belgravia or Chelsea, and it is close enough to the docks that supplies and materials can be procured with discretion." "Then we must approach her," I said. "We must find a way to enter her circle, to meet her, to discover what she wants and whether there is any possibility of negotiation." Adrian rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the fog-shrouded street below. "There is no negotiation possible," he said. "Helena Voss has dedicated her entire life to the pursuit of consciousness transfer. For her, I represent both a triumph and a failure, a success that proves her theories correct, but also a failure in the sense that I am not under her control, that I have escaped, that I am living a life of my own choosing, rather than in a laboratory being studied and dissected." "Then perhaps we offer her something she wants," I suggested. "Perhaps we offer her the opportunity to study your degradation, to document the process by which your consciousness fragments. Perhaps we offer her the chance to solve the problem she did not solve with Gray, the problem of consciousness stability." Adrian turned to look at me with an expression of startled recognition. "You are proposing that we voluntarily return to a form of captivity," he said slowly, "that we enter her laboratory under the pretense of seeking her help, and in doing so, place ourselves entirely within her power." "I am proposing that we recognize the reality of our situation," I replied calmly. "You are dying, Adrian. You are dying slowly, but you are dying nonetheless. Without access to the serum that maintains your consciousness, you will degrade completely within a year. Helena Voss is the only person alive who has the knowledge and the resources to prevent that degradation. So yes, I am proposing that we go to her, but we do not go as victims. We go as equals. We go as people who understand the value of what we represent and who are willing to negotiate for the solution we need." Over the next week, I made careful inquiries through my new social circles, seeking to discover the location of Helena Voss's laboratory and the circumstances under which one might gain access to it. I discovered that she gave occasional private lectures to invited audiences, discussions of her theoretical work that were conducted in a space that was part salon, part laboratory. The next such lecture was scheduled for the following Friday evening, and I was able to secure an invitation through the same gentleman who had first mentioned her name to me. Adrian was apprehensive about the plan, but he acquiesced to it nonetheless. On the evening of the lecture, we dressed carefully. I in a gown of dark blue that suggested both refinement and intellectual seriousness, Adrian in evening clothes that emphasized the elegant severity of his new form. We traveled by carriage to the address in Southwark, a nondescript building that might have housed anything from a warehouse to a shipping office. The lecture hall was on the second floor, and it was already filled with perhaps 24 men and women of varying ages, all of them carrying the particular intensity of expression that distinguishes those genuinely engaged with intellectual pursuits. And standing at the front of the room, preparing her materials with the focused concentration of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation, was Helena Voss. I knew immediately that I was looking at a woman who represented everything that society had taught us women could never be: independent, unmarried, powerful, and utterly unconstrained by the conventions that bound the rest of us. She was perhaps 40 years old, with sharp features and intelligent gray eyes that held the same shade as Adrian's. Her hair was pulled back severely from her face, and her clothing was practical and masculine in its cut, as though she had rejected the constraints of conventional femininity in favor of freedom of movement. She did not immediately notice us as we took our seats at the back of the room. But as the lecture began, and she started to discuss her theories of consciousness transfer, I saw her eyes scan the audience with the focused intensity of a predator, and I watched as those eyes came to rest on Adrian. For a moment, her composure fractured. Her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the lectern, and then, with what appeared to be a supreme act of will, she regained her control and continued her presentation as though nothing had happened. When the lecture concluded and the audience began to disperse, Helena approached us directly. She was tall, taller than I would have expected, and her presence commanded the space around her. "I thought you were dead," she said to Adrian, her voice low and controlled, but with an undercurrent of barely suppressed fury. "I thought the fire had consumed the laboratory and all of its contents, including you. I have been searching London for 3 years, and I believed I was chasing a ghost." "I am not dead," Adrian replied calmly. "Though I am, as you have undoubtedly deduced, degrading. I am here because I have come to understand that you are the only person alive who can help me prevent that degradation from becoming complete." Helena's eyes flickered to me, and I saw the moment of recognition cross her face. "And this is your wife," she said. "The Duchess of Ashford, if my sources are accurate. The woman who was supposedly plunged into grief by your death and who has spent the past 3 years living a life of exemplary widowhood." "She is," Adrian confirmed. "And she is here because she loves me enough to bargain with the woman who helped to transform me into whatever I have become." Helena smiled, and it was a smile without warmth, without mercy, without any of the conventional markers of human decency. "Then, perhaps we should all retire to my laboratory," she said. "Perhaps we should have a conversation about the nature of consciousness, the price of immortality, and the particular debt that you owe to me for the gift of your continued existence. I have been waiting a long time for this opportunity, Adrian, and I find myself loath to waste it." She gestured toward the door, and I saw 2 large men position themselves to ensure that we understood we had no choice but to comply. Adrian reached out and took my hand, and I felt him squeeze it, a gesture that might have been reassurance or might have been an apology for the fate into which he was drawing me. As we descended the stairs toward whatever awaited us in Helena's laboratory, I found myself thinking that love, in its truest form, is not a refuge from danger, but rather a choice to face that danger together. And as we emerged into the Southwark fog, I understood that the real test of our union was only beginning. The laboratory was nothing like I had imagined. I had expected something akin to Dr. Gray's underground chamber, dark, oppressive, filled with the machinery of violation and forced transformation. Instead, Helena's laboratory was a place of terrible beauty. It occupied the entire top 2 floors of the Southwark building, and it was lit by an elaborate system of gas lamps that created a kind of twilight illumination throughout the vast space. Along the walls were shelves containing thousands of glass vessels, each one holding liquids of different colors, some luminescent, some opaque, some clear as spring water. There were anatomical drawings rendered with exquisite precision, mapping not the physical body, but something that seemed to exist beneath it. neural pathways that branched like trees, consciousness rendered as a kind of landscape of impossible complexity. At the center of the laboratory stood the machine. It was constructed of brass and copper and materials I could not identify, and it rose toward the ceiling like a cathedral built to worship at the altar of human transcendence. There were chairs positioned at intervals, platforms for bodies, chambers that appeared designed to contain something that could not be contained by ordinary means. And as I looked at this apparatus, I understood that this was the true heart of Helena's obsession. Not the transfer of consciousness from one body to another, but the pursuit of consciousness itself, the attempt to understand and manipulate the very thing that makes us human. Magnificent, is it not? Helena said, her voice carrying the particular pride of an artist regarding her masterwork. She gestured for us to stand before the machine, and the two guards who had escorted us down into the laboratory took positions at the doors, preventing any attempt at escape. This is the culmination of 15 years of research, of failed experiments and theoretical breakthroughs, and the slow accumulation of knowledge that most of the scientific establishment would consider not merely impossible, but blasphemous. It is a monument to obsession, Adrian replied quietly. I have seen machines like this before, in Gray's laboratory. They perform their functions, they achieve their technical objectives, and yet they are built on a foundation of profound misunderstanding about the nature of consciousness itself. Helena's expression hardened, and I saw her hand move to a device on the control panel beside the machine. You do not understand what you are talking about, she said coldly. You are a product of this machine, Adrian. You are living proof that consciousness can be transferred, preserved, transformed. You are the culmination of everything I have theorized and worked toward. And yet you claim that I misunderstand the very phenomenon that I have successfully demonstrated? I claim that you have succeeded in creating a copy, Adrian said, and I heard something shift in his voice, a kind of resignation mixed with a terrible certainty. You have created a consciousness that believes itself to be Adrian, that has all of Adrian's memories up to a certain point, that performs Adrian's emotional patterns and intellectual functions. But you have not preserved Adrian himself. You have created a being that exists in a state of profound doubt about the nature of his own existence, and that is a far more complex and terrible thing than simple success. I felt Helena's eyes turn toward me, studying me with an intensity that suggested she was trying to determine whether I was genuinely complicit in Adrian's doubts or whether I might be persuaded to see matters differently. Tell me, she said to me, do you believe that the man standing beside you is truly your husband? That the consciousness inhabiting that body is the same consciousness that occupied his previous form? I had prepared for this question during the carriage ride to the laboratory, but no amount of preparation could have made the answering of it feel anything less than momentous. I believe, I said carefully, that the question itself is predicated on a false assumption. I believe that identity is not a fixed thing that can be transferred like water poured from one vessel to another. Identity is a narrative, a story that we tell ourselves about who we are and how we have become that self. Adrian's previous identity was constrained by the social expectations of his rank and position, by the secrets that he carried, by the fear that those secrets engendered. The consciousness that now inhabits his new body has the same memories, the same fundamental inclinations, but it is no longer constrained by those same fears. Therefore, it is both entirely Adrian and an entirely new being. Both statements are true simultaneously. Helena regarded me with what might have been respect. You are more philosophical than I would have expected of an aristocratic widow, she said. Perhaps that is why Adrian was drawn to you, despite the coldness that characterized your marriage. Perhaps he recognized in you the capacity for the kind of thinking that would be necessary to comprehend what he had become. She moved toward us, and as she did, I became aware of a strange humming sound emanating from the machine. The sound was low and resonant, and it seemed to vibrate through the floor and into my body, setting my teeth on edge. I have been monitoring your degradation, Helena continued, addressing Adrian directly. I have had agents watching the boarding houses and cheap hotels of London for weeks, waiting for you to reveal yourself. When you appeared at that ball, I knew immediately. I felt it in my bones, in the core of my being where consciousness itself seems to reside. I have been tracking you, measuring the rate at which your coherence is fragmenting, and I have come to a fascinating conclusion. She gestured for Adrian to step closer to the machine, and to my horror, he moved toward it without resistance, as though drawn by forces he could not resist. "The degradation is accelerating," Helena said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering a scientific truth. "It is not proceeding at the rate that Margaret Price predicted. In fact, the rate of acceleration suggests that your consciousness will achieve complete fragmentation, not in a year, as you may have been told, but in a matter of weeks. The new body is rejecting the consciousness, you see. It is like an immune response, except instead of attacking foreign pathogens, it is attacking the very thing that makes you sentient, that makes you aware. Gray did not anticipate this. He believed that consciousness could be transferred and remain stable indefinitely. But he did not account for the fact that consciousness is not merely a pattern that can be replicated. It is a dynamic process, a continuous interaction between the container and the contained. Adrian stopped in front of the machine, and I saw him place his hand against its cold surface. "Then I am dying," he said simply. "We both knew this, but now we know the timeline with more precision. I have perhaps weeks rather than months or years." "You are dying," Helena agreed. "But you do not have to accept that death as inevitable. I can transfer your consciousness into a new body, one constructed with the knowledge that I have gained since Gray's original experiment. I can create a vessel that will not reject you, that will maintain your coherence indefinitely. I can give you the immortality that Gray promised and failed to deliver." I understood then, with a clarity that was almost painful, what Helena truly wanted. It was not revenge against Adrian, not the desire to study him or understand him. What Helena wanted was validation. She wanted Adrian to acknowledge that her work was superior to Gray's, that her understanding of consciousness transfer was more complete, that she had solved the problems that had defeated her predecessor. She wanted to be proven right, to be vindicated, to have her obsession justified by success. "And the price?" Adrian asked quietly. "The price is your consent," Helena said. "You will enter the machine. You will undergo the transfer. Your consciousness will be moved into a new body, one designed according to my specifications and my understanding of how consciousness can be stabilized and preserved. And then you will remain here, in my laboratory, where I can continue to study you, to document your progress, to ensure that the transfer has been successful." "You are asking me to become a prisoner again," Adrian said. "You are asking me to trade one form of captivity for another, even if the captivity you offer promises longevity. I am asking you to trade the illusion of freedom for the reality of survival," Helena corrected. "That woman standing behind you, Adrian, your Catherine, she loves you now because you are a novelty, a resurrection, an impossibility made flesh. But that love will not sustain you if you degrade into a hollow shell. That love will not survive your transformation into a barely conscious automaton, animated by machinery, but devoid of any of the qualities that make you worth loving. I am offering you the chance to preserve what you are, and in doing so, I am offering her the chance to continue to love what you have become." I realized that Helena believed what she was saying, that she genuinely did not understand the fundamental error in her reasoning. She had spent so many years in pursuit of consciousness transfer that she had lost sight of the fact that consciousness itself was not the ultimate good, that survival at any cost was not automatically preferable to ending with dignity and authenticity. "No," I heard myself say, and both Adrian and Helena turned to look at me. "No, Adrian will not consent to your procedure, and I will tell you why." I stepped forward, moving between Adrian and the machine, placing myself in the path of whatever Helena might attempt to do next. "You speak of love as though it is a simple thing, as though it can be sustained by the mere presence of the beloved," I said to Helena. "But love is not simple. Love is the accumulation of moments, the continuous choice to see another person as they are and to accept them despite their imperfections and their limitations and their mortality. I married Adrian 3 years ago, and I did not love him. I obeyed him. I performed the role of his wife. I was dutiful and compliant, and utterly absent from the marriage in any meaningful sense. But then he died, and I grieved not for him, but for the woman that I was when married to him, and I discovered that I had been released into freedom. I paused, and I saw Helena's expression shift, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or might have been understanding. And then Adrian returned, I continued, and he was a stranger, and he was terrifying, and he was more real and more present and more genuinely himself than he had ever been when he was simply a duke living according to expectations. I have chosen to love him not despite his degradation, but in full knowledge of it. I have chosen to love him because he is finite, because he is mortal, because there is an ending approaching that makes every moment we have together precious and real and true. If I love him forever, if his consciousness never degrades, if he becomes immortal, then our love would become something else. It would become habit or possession or the exercise of power over another being. But if I love him knowing that I will lose him, then our love becomes redemption. Helena studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. It was as though she were looking at a phenomenon she had never encountered before, something that did not fit into her theoretical framework about consciousness and transfer and the nature of human existence. You would choose his death over his immortality, she said slowly, as though the concept was almost incomprehensible to her. I would choose his authentic ending over his manufactured preservation, I replied. I would choose real love over simulated immortality. I would choose to say goodbye over the slow dissolution of the person I have come to love into the person your procedures would make him. Adrian reached out and took my hand, and I felt him squeeze it with a force that seemed to carry all of the emotion he no longer had the words to express. I cannot ask her to do this, he said to Helena. I cannot ask her to watch me degrade, to remain at my side as I slowly lose coherence, to endure the pain of my dissolution. Even if I wished to accept your offer, even if I wanted to surrender myself to your procedures and your study, I could not do it knowing what it would cost her. Then you are both fools, Helena said coldly, and she turned away from us, moving toward the control panel of the machine. You are both choosing illusion over reality, choosing comfort over truth. You are choosing a lie over the difficult work of understanding what consciousness actually is. But even as she spoke, I saw something shift in her face. I saw, perhaps for the first time, a moment of genuine doubt. I saw her confront the possibility that everything she had worked toward, all of the sacrifice and obsession and moral compromise, might have been in service of a goal that was not merely difficult, but fundamentally flawed. The guards at the door had been watching this exchange with increasing confusion, clearly uncertain about whom they should be taking orders from. Adrian seized the moment of hesitation and moved toward the control panel with a speed that was almost inhuman. The physical enhancement that Gray's creation had provided him, giving him advantages that any ordinary man would not possess. He struck one of the guards, and the man went down. The other guard moved toward Adrian, but I found myself moving as well, pulling the leather chair from beside the machine and swinging it with all of the strength I possessed. It connected with the second guard's head, and he collapsed. "Run," Adrian said to me, and for a moment I saw panic flicker across his face. "Catherine, run. We must get out of this place." But I did not run. Instead, I moved to the control panel and began examining the machinery, searching for the mechanism that would shut down the apparatus, that would prevent Helena from using it to drag us both into her laboratory and her procedures. "I am a scientist," Adrian said quietly, moving to stand beside me. "Gray made me understand something of the machinery before he died. The core system, there, you see that valve? If you open it, the entire mechanism will depressurize. The apparatus will become unstable." I found the valve and began to turn it. The humming sound that had been emanating from the machine intensified, became almost unbearable, and I saw lights beginning to flicker across the control panel. Behind us, Helena was moving, reaching for something beneath the control panel, a weapon perhaps, or some kind of emergency mechanism. And then the machine exploded. It was not a violent explosion, not in the sense of fire or shrapnel or the kind of destruction that one might expect from machinery suddenly rendered unstable. Instead, it was a kind of implosion, as though all of the energy that the machine had been containing was suddenly released inward, collapsing into itself. There was a sound like breaking glass, and then a kind of silence that was almost more terrifying than any noise could have been. When the silence broke, I heard only the sound of my own breathing, and Adrian's breathing, and the wind whistling through the broken machinery. The laboratory that had seemed so magnificent moments before was now a ruin. Glass vessels shattered, copper pipes burst open, the great machine reduced to twisted metal and scattered components. Helena was standing motionless in the center of the destruction, her hands still raised, her eyes fixed on the destroyed apparatus with an expression that suggested her mind was struggling to process what had just occurred. Around us, the remaining guards began to back away, clearly unsure of what should happen next in the absence of any clear orders from their employer. "We must go," Adrian said urgently, taking my hand. "We must leave this place now, while we still have the opportunity." But I found myself unable to move. I was staring at Helena, and I was overcome with a profound sadness. Here was a woman who had dedicated her entire existence to the pursuit of a single goal, and in the space of a few moments, that goal had been rendered impossible. She had built her entire identity around the work of consciousness transfer, and now that work was literally in ruins around her. "I am sorry," I said to her, and I meant it. "I am sorry for what you have lost." Helena turned to look at me, and her eyes held a kind of terrible emptiness. "You do not understand," she said quietly. "You do not understand what I have given up, what I have sacrificed in pursuit of this work. I had a sister, you know. She was brilliant, more brilliant than I could ever hope to be. But she contracted a wasting disease when she was 30 years old, and she died in agony, her mind still sharp and active, even as her body betrayed her. She begged me to find a way to preserve consciousness, to separate the mind from its failing flesh. I have spent my entire life trying to fulfill that request, and now, because of you, because of your romantic notions about mortality and love, that work is destroyed." I understood then that Helena Voss was not truly a villain. She was a woman who had been wounded by loss, just as I had been, and who had chosen to respond to that loss by pursuing knowledge rather than by accepting the limitations of human existence. She had made a choice that I could not make, but I could at least acknowledge the validity of her grief, even if I could not endorse her methods. "There will be other ways," I said gently. "There will be other scientists, other approaches. The work you have done is not lost simply because this apparatus is destroyed. It is recorded in your mind, in your papers, in the consciousness that no machine can ever duplicate or replicate." Helena shook her head slowly. "I do not know how to continue," she said. "I have been so focused on the apparatus, on the transfer, that I have forgotten why I was doing it. I have forgotten my sister's face, the sound of her voice. I have built this entire life around the pursuit of her memory, and I have lost sight of the memory itself in the process. I do not know who I am without this work. I do not know how to exist as a woman rather than as a scientist pursuing the impossible." Adrian and I exchanged a glance, and I saw in his eyes the same understanding that I was experiencing. Helena Voss needed help, but it was not the kind of help that could be provided by remaining in her laboratory or engaging with her apparatus. She needed to be released from the prison of her own obsession. "Come with us," I said to her, and Adrian's hand tightened on mine. "Come away from this place. There is a woman in Whitechapel, a woman named Margaret Price, who understands what you have experienced, who has suffered from the same obsession. Perhaps the two of you could help each other begin to remember how to live." For a moment, I thought Helena might refuse. I thought she might turn away from the possibility of redemption and choose instead to remain in the ruins of her work, a monument to the price of obsession. But then slowly, she reached out and took my other hand. "I do not know if I can change," she said quietly. "I do not know if I am capable of being anything other than what I have become." "Neither did I replied. 3 years ago, I believed that I would spend the rest of my life as a widow, performing the role of the grieving duchess, existing only in the spaces between other people's lives. But then Adrian returned, and I was forced to become someone new. You are capable of change, Helena. We are all capable of becoming something other than what we have been." We left the laboratory together, the three of us, walking out into the Southwark fog as though we were the most natural of companions. The guards did not attempt to stop us. Perhaps they saw in our departure something that they recognized as inevitable, or perhaps they simply did not know how to respond to a situation in which their employer had ceased to give orders and the authority structure that had governed their employment had crumbled. The night was very dark and very cold, and the fog hung so thickly over London that I could barely see the street ahead of us. We found a carriage for hire and instructed the driver to take us to Whitechapel, to the small apartment where Margaret Price lived in solitary exile from the world. We did not speak during the journey. Adrian held my hand, and I held Helena's hand, and all three of us seemed to be lost in the particular kind of contemplation that follows the confrontation with something larger than ourselves. When we arrived at Margaret's apartment and I knocked on the door, the elderly woman who answered seemed unsurprised to see us. Perhaps she had been expecting this outcome, or perhaps she had simply come to understand that the world was far stranger and far more merciful than conventional logic would suggest. She stepped aside and allowed us to enter, and as we crossed the threshold into her small room, I felt something settle in my chest, not quite peace, but something close to it. A recognition that the story I had been living was reaching its conclusion, and that I could begin to write a new story, one that acknowledged what had been lost but focused on what remained. Over the following months, Adrian's degradation continued, but it proceeded at a slower rate than Helena had predicted. Whether this was because the destruction of her apparatus had somehow interrupted or modified the process, or whether it was simply that love itself possessed some kind of preservative quality that science had not yet learned to quantify, I could not say. We lived together in a small cottage in the Cotswolds, far from the scrutiny of London society, and we spent our days walking through countryside, reading together, having the kinds of conversations that I had always hoped a marriage might permit, but that had never seemed possible in the world of aristocratic constraint. Adrian's mind remained sharp, but his memory began to fragment around the edges. There were mornings when he did not immediately recognize me, and there were afternoons when he seemed to exist partially in another time, speaking to people who had died years before. But even as his consciousness began to dissolve, I found that my love for him deepened rather than diminished. I loved him not despite his degradation, but because that degradation was authentic, was real, was a testament to the fact that he had been willing to live as himself rather than as a construct designed to fit the expectations of others. He died on a cold February morning, 6 months after we left London. He died in his sleep, his hand still holding mine, his breathing gradually slowing until it stopped entirely. And in the moment when I realized that he was gone, I felt not despair, but a kind of completion. We had been given a gift that few lovers receive, time enough to know each other truly, to strip away all of the pretense and performance and social constraint that usually surrounds human connection. We had been given the opportunity to love each other not as Duke and Duchess, not as constructed roles determined by society, but as two people stripped bare of everything except our essential selves. Helena and Margaret, who had become something like sisters during the months we spent together in that cottage, helped me prepare his body for burial. I chose a simple grave in the churchyard of the small village, with a headstone that bore only his name and the dates of his existence. No epitaph, no grand statement about his achievements or his significance, simply a marker that said, Adrian was here, and now he is gone. In the years that followed, I discovered that what society had called my scandal, my disappearance, my elopement with a man who was legally dead, my rejection of my position and my title, had faded into obscurity as new scandals arose to capture the attention of London's gossips. I ceased to be the fascinating widow and became instead merely another woman living quietly in the country, someone to be noted but not remarked upon. I corresponded with Margaret and Helena, and I watched as they slowly rebuilt their lives in the spaces between science and spirituality, becoming something like friends, something like sisters, something like a family constructed not by blood or duty, but by the shared understanding of loss and redemption. And sometimes, in those quiet moments before sleep, I would return to the night of my ball, to the moment when Adrian had appeared in my doorway, and asked for a last dance. I would remember the weight of his hand on my waist, the precise color of his eyes, the particular way he had moved through the crowd as though he alone understood that the rules of society had temporarily suspended. And I would feel grateful, not for what he had given me, wealth, position, the validation of society, but for what he had taken away. He had taken from me the certainty that I knew how to live, and in doing so, he had given me the freedom to discover how to truly exist. I am an old woman now, and the world has moved on in ways that would have been unimaginable to the younger version of myself. The spiritualists and the mediums have become fashionable again, and people gather in darkened parlors hoping to contact the souls of the dead. But I have never attempted to contact Adrian through any of these means. I do not believe that consciousness survives the dissolution of the body, and even if it does, I think he deserves to rest, to exist in whatever peace or oblivion awaits us all. What I have learned is that love does not require the continuation of the beloved. Love is complete in itself, entire in the moment of its expression, sufficient unto itself without needing to transcend the barriers of death and time. And if I am asked, on rare occasions, what I did with my life after I ceased to be the Duke's widow, I tell them that I learned to dance in the darkness with a man who could no longer quite remember his own name. I tell them that I discovered that the greatest love stories are not the ones that promise eternity, but the ones that embrace the finite and make every moment matter precisely because it will not last. I tell them that I learned that consciousness is not what survives, but what we create in the spaces between existing and being seen by others. The dead do not return, asking for a last dance. But love, true love, the kind that demands our authenticity and offers no promises except the promise of presence. Love returns to us every day in the small moments of recognition, in the quick intake of breath when we see someone and understand, in the way that loss and joy become indistinguishable from one another once we have loved truly. And if Adrian's consciousness continues somewhere beyond the boundaries of death, I hope he knows this. I loved him not for what he was or what he became, but for the courage it took him to be anything at all. In a world that demanded that he be eternal, unchanging, perfect in his aristocratic distance, he chose instead to be finite, fragile, and real. And that choice, more than any machine or apparatus or scientific breakthrough, was the true miracle. That choice was the consciousness that mattered. That choice was the immortality that science had never quite managed to achieve.